Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a medieval bakery before sunrise, where the floor is dirt. The air smells like scorched grain, and you're about to do something profoundly weird. Swear an oath to a loaf of bread. You're wearing a flour-streaked apron, your hands are calloused from kneading dough, and your neighbors are watching to make sure you don't cheat, steal, or sneak sawdust into your mix again. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love seeing how far this sleepy little bakery spreads. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge across the uneven cobblestone alleyway just as the town cockerel gives its half-hearted crow. It's not quite dawn, but the bakery's hearth has already been lit for hours. The heat presses out from the stone oven like an ancient dragon's breath. And the scent of yeast, ash, and burning oak wraps around your nostrils in a way that's both comforting and a little singe. You're here to bake, sure, but first, you've got to swear. Not in the modern, throw an F-bomb when you burn your toast kind of way. No, this is formal, serious, legal. You place your palm on a fresh, round loaf, still steaming, and speak the words that bind your bread making to the law of the land. You swear to make loaves of the proper weight, the right flour, and never to cheat your townsfolk by inflating your crusts or hollowing out the middle. And yes, people actually did this. Bakers in medieval towns were often required to take literal oaths, invoking God and the saints, that their loaves would be honest and true. You weren't just feeding the town, you were feeding the moral backbone of it. Why such drama over carbs? Well, bread back then wasn't just breakfast, it was survival. It was the center of nearly every meal, the foundation of wages, the gift at weddings, and the comfort at funerals. Mess with bread, and you were messing with the fragile threads holding medieval society together. There's even a case recorded in 13th century England where a baker's loaves were found underweight. And he was publicly punished, not just fined, but placed in a pillory with the very bread tied around his neck. As if to say, here lies a man whose loaves were as hollow as his integrity. So yes, when you kneel in the morning light and whisper your oath to that crusty round of barley and rye, you're doing more than promising decent food. You're anchoring yourself to a system of trust in a world that had very little of it. Because remember, no phones, no barcodes, no Yelp reviews. If someone bought your bread and found it wanting, the news would spread faster than butter on toast. Historians still argue whether these bread oaths were strictly enforced or more ceremonial in quieter towns. But in cities like London or Rouen, bakers did and did get hauled before magistrates. And worse, before mobs. The oven crackles behind you. The dough is rising. And just like that, your day begins. One eye on the flame, one hand on the dough, and one promise on your lips. The bread will be good. The bread will be fair. The bread will be true. Now, you'd think that would be enough. But no, in the medieval world, it wasn't just about making the bread. You had to understand its power. Blank, underscore, blank. Grain is power. You grip the long wooden peel with both hands, easing a rounded loaf deep into the waiting mouth of the oven. The heat blasts your face, and a bead of sweat slips past your eyebrow. But the real pressure you feel isn't from the fire. It's from the weight of history, of expectation, of responsibility. Because in the world you live in, grain isn't just food, it's power. And you, humble baker though you may be, are one of the last guardians of that power. Grain, in the medieval world, was currency, status, politics, and survival all mashed into one. Without it, empires crumbled. With it, kings fed armies and peasants clung to life through the bitterest winters. If you controlled the grain, you controlled the people, period. It's hard to overstate how central grain was to everything. Across Europe, it made up the majority of the average person's diet, sometimes as much as 70 to 80%. Bread wasn't the side dish. It was the meal. Meat was rare, vegetables seasonal and sparse. But bread was the one constant. The reliable calorie delivery system. If it failed, if your bread wasn't ready, or was bad, or was missing altogether, people didn't go hungry. They got angry. And often, they got violent. And yet, not all bread was equal. If you were wealthy, you'd enjoy fine white bread made from sifted wheat flour, fluffy, refined, nearly sweet. This bread was so pure it looked like it came from the heavens. The kind of bread that makes your teeth sigh. The kind you, as a working baker, rarely get to taste unless you're sampling the product with suspicious frequency. Your bread, on the other hand, barley, rye, maybe a little oat flour if the market was generous. Your loaves are brown, dense, heavy as bricks, and capable of minor dental injuries if eaten too fast. But they're nourishing, honest, and in a world like this, that's more important than gourmet. Your flour isn't even yours. Really, it's been through several hands before reaching your table. The peasant who harvested it, the landlord who taxed it, the miller who ground it, and maybe helped himself to a few handfuls in the process. That miller? Let's just say he's not your favorite guy. Millers were infamous for cheating on weights. And some even designed their mills with hidden troughs to siphon off grain without customers noticing. And because they were often protected by the local lord or church, complaints tended to vanish faster than a hot roll at lunchtime. The grain supply chain is a mess, full of tolls, tithes, and tricks. Sometimes the grain has been stored too long, or got wet, or had something questionable crawl through it. But you can't afford to be picky. You sift, sniff, and shake out what you can. You whisper a quick prayer to Saint Honoré, patron saint of bakers, and you get on with it. In some towns, you're not even allowed to own your own oven. Crazy, right? You have to use the Lord's communal oven. Pay a fee for every bake. He owns the fire, just like he owns the land and the grain and probably the very ground your shop stands on. You mix your dough by candlelight. Measure the weight carefully, and trek across the square to that massive stone furnace, hoping you don't trip and drop a loaf in the mud. Again, and even when you bake everything perfectly, you still have to worry about inspections. Local officials come by, checking your loaves for weight, size, and quality. They'll cut your bread in half right in front of you, feeling the texture, checking for air pockets, maybe sniffing it like some kind of yeasty sommelier. If it doesn't pass, you get fined, or worse. One baker in 13th century France was caught mixing chalk into his flour to stretch it. And he was paraded through town with the loaves hung around his neck. Medieval shame was not subtle. Historians still argue whether shortages in certain cities were always the result of crop failures or whether the upper class manipulated supply for personal gain. Likely both. Grain merchants, landowners, and even the clergy sometimes hoarded grain, waiting for prices to spike before releasing it onto the market. You're just the guy trying to get loaves out before noon, while fending off customers who think you're part of the problem. And oh, those customers. When bread prices rise, even by a little, it's your window that gets the rock. It's your name that gets whispered behind hands in the market. No one curses the miller. No one throws stones at the cathedral granary. It's your flour-covered apron they point at when their stomachs are growling. Still, you get up before dawn, every day, to face the oven, because what choice do you have? Bread is everything. It's wages. Workers are literally paid in loaves sometimes. It's alms, bread handed to the poor in exchange for blessings. It's offerings to saints, to gods, to the dearly departed. You remember your grandmother placing a slice of bread near the hearth on All Souls' Day, just in case a wandering spirit needed a snack. And yes, there's magic in it too. Some people believe bread baked on St. Bridget's Day will cure fevers. Others hang crusts in doorways to ward off evil spirits. And let's not even get into the weird superstition about cutting into a fresh loaf and finding a hollow center being an omen of death. Let's pretend that's never happened to one of your loaves. Okay? You pull a batch from the oven and set it on the shelf. The crust cracks as it cools, singing that soft, crinkly song only fresh bread can make. For a moment, you feel proud, like you've done something real, something ancient, something holy. Because, strange as it seems, the baker is one of the few people everyone depends on but no one wants to cross. Your job is thankless, stressful, and probably aging you faster than a royal taster. But without you, no one eats. So you go on, with aching wrists, smoke-stung eyes, and 1,000 tiny burns on your arms. You feed the people, you calm the market, you keep the peace in a town where a missing loaf could start a riot. And every day, when you measure the flour and knead the dough and whisper your oath to that stubborn little lump of bread, you're not just baking, you're wielding the oldest power in the world, the power to nourish, to calm, to sustain, one loaf at a time. Bakers, secret urban elites? The sun's barely risen, and already your bakery smells like history. Rich, floury history with just a touch of wood smoke and, if you're honest, a hint of stress sweat. But don't sell yourself short. You might think you're just a simple craftsman in a smudged apron. But in the bustling medieval town around you, bakers hold a strange, often underestimated kind of clout. You're not nobility, not clergy, not royalty, but you're essential. And in the tight, interwoven threads of medieval urban life, that makes you part of something bigger than most people realize. You see, in an age where food scarcity could make or break a kingdom, the baker wasn't just a guy with dough under his fingernails, he was a lifeline. Cities couldn't survive without bread, and those who controlled its flow, they had leverage, maybe not the glamorous, wine-soaked, jewel-dripping power of a duke or countess, but real, tangible authority, the kind that makes people knock on your door instead of kick it in. Well, most of the time. In fact, in many towns, bakers formed their own guilds, tight-knit, highly organized, occasionally secretive collectives that set prices, controlled quality, and trained apprentices. You couldn't just open a bakery and call yourself a master. No sir. You had to be accepted, endorsed, tested, sometimes even initiated, which sounds suspiciously like a medieval frat party. Minus the beer pong and with way more sourdough. Through these guilds, bakers influenced trade policy, enforced standards, and even had a say in local politics. Some guild leaders sat on town councils or advised magistrates. They kept records, oversaw taxation, and made sure no one was sneaking pebbles into the rye to boost the weight. Yes, that happened. Pebbles. In bread. I mean, carbs are heavy enough already. This strange prominence meant that bakers walked a delicate line. On one hand, they were needed. On the other, they were watched closely. If you, the baker, got too rich, too fast, or if your bread was always perfectly baked when others were struggling, people whispered, was he hoarding grain? Was he colluding with merchants? Is he in with the bishop? And heaven help you if your prices went up the same week the town heard rumors of a poor harvest. Suddenly you weren't just a baker, you were a suspect. Historians still debate how much real political sway bakers had, especially compared to wealthier trades like goldsmiths or wool merchants. But in places like Paris, Bruges, and Florence, records show bakers involved in civic decisions, negotiating trade deals, and even contributing to city defenses. Imagine someone saying, "Quick, call the bakers, we're under siege," and then you roll up with a spatula and very serious eyebrows. There were perks, too. Bakers often received preferential access to grain supplies during shortages, provided they kept producing for the public. The city needed bread, especially during war or famine, and that meant protecting the bakers. In return, bakers were expected to keep their ovens hot and their prices steady. Even if they were working at a loss, public good came before personal profit. Or at least, that was the ideal. And here's the twist. All this visibility meant bakers had reputations to maintain. You couldn't just be good at baking, you had to be respectable. Clean, honest, religious. If you were caught in scandal, drunk in public, fornicating with the wrong spouse, cheating on bread weight, it wasn't just personal shame. It was guild shame. Your peers might fine you, expel you, or worse, force you to apprentice again. And trust me, no one wants to go back to sweeping flour and carrying sacks at age 43. You stir a bubbling pot of scalding water to clean the boards. And glance out the window at the marketplace across the lane. There's the fishmonger, already yelling about eels. There's the alewife, dragging barrels out of her cellar with a glare that could curdle milk. And there, on the far side, is the tax collector's clerk, pale, nervous, nibbling on a crust you recognize. Your crust. That's right. The town officials buy your bread, too, because it's reliable, consistent, trustworthy, and that makes you valuable. Maybe not powerful in the castle storming sense, but certainly in the what you do matters to everyone sense. Here's a quirky tidbit for you. In some towns, bakers were so central to civic life that they had designated uniforms for feast days. Robes, hats, sometimes even embroidered gloves, worn during official guild ceremonies. One guild in the Netherlands had a rule that during weddings or funerals of fellow bakers, all members had to walk in procession, holding loaves like sacred relics. Try explaining that to a tourist. Of course, not every baker thrived. Competition was fierce, especially in larger cities where dozens of bakeries lined the streets. Reputation was everything. If word spread that your bread was underweight or moldy or cursed by a local nun, yes, that happened too. Your business could collapse overnight. Loyalty from customers was strong, but so was gossip. You wipe your hands on a flour-dusted cloth and begin forming new rounds for the next batch. The rhythm of it is soothing. Press, fold, shape. The dough yields under your palms like wet clay. Like memory. You think of the apprentice you took in last year, skinny kid with a stutter and an absurd fear of yeast. Now he's waking before dawn without complaint, slapping dough like a pro. That's guild life, too. Not just power and politics, but teaching, passing it on, keeping the fire burning. Historians still argue whether guilds helped or hindered economic growth. Some say they kept standards high and training strong. Others argue they blocked innovation, resisted change, and created monopolies. But one thing's clear. In a world where trust was rare and food was sacred, bakers had to be more than artisans. They had to be stewards of the public table. So yes, while the mayor might wear a velvet robe, and the bishop might swing incense at the cathedral, you, the baker, hold something equally holy. You hold the daily bread. The thing everyone needs. The reason the town wakes, works, eats, and dreams. It's easy to miss that in the bustle of baking and the ache of your back. But you remember it when a merchant tips his hat, when a mother thanks you for an extra crust, when the town's most powerful people trust your bread with their breakfast. You may never sit on a throne, but you, my flour-dusted friend, are nobility in your own right. A quiet kind, a practical kind, the kind that feeds a city and asks only for enough heat to keep the oven burning. Weight matters. The bread scales. You stand before your wooden worktable, hands dusted with flour, dough nestled in rising baskets, and then, like every morning, comes the most nerve-wracking moment of all. You reach for the scale. It's a simple contraption, 2 brass trays balanced on a crossbeam. Not unlike the ones used by jewelers. But today it doesn't measure emeralds or silver. No, today it weighs your reputation. Because in this town, and in nearly every town across medieval Europe, the weight of your bread is law. Not suggestion, not guideline, law. And if your loaf comes up short, the consequences range from humiliation to bankruptcy, and if you're really unlucky, a brisk visit to the pillory. People don't just want fair bread. They demand it. In an age where most folks survive on bread alone, they expect it to be honest, filling, and crucially, not hollow in the middle. Which, by the way, was a favorite scam among less honorable bakers. Pack the crust thick, shape the outside just right, but leave the inside like a bread-shaped balloon. Sneaky, clever, and a guaranteed fast track to public shaming if you're caught. So every loaf that passes through your fingers gets weighed carefully, often nervously. A fraction too light and you're in trouble. A fraction too heavy and you're losing money. It's a high-stakes balancing act, and your fingers are trained to sense the difference before the scale even tips. You press your thumb into the dough with the practiced confidence of someone who's sweated through 100 inspections. This is muscle memory and survival instinct. That obsession with weight? It all goes back to something called the Assize of Bread and Ale, an English law first issued in the 13th century. And possibly the most boring-sounding law with the most aggressive real-world consequences. It dictated exactly how much a loaf of bread should weigh depending on the current cost of flour. The goal was to protect the public from price gouging during bad harvests or shady business deals. You didn't get to set your own prices. Oh no, the local authority did that for you. If wheat cost more, the bread could be lighter. If wheat was cheap, the bread had to be heavier. And they monitored this with the unblinking stare of a very cranky librarian. You, dear baker, were not allowed to profit freely from market fluctuation. Instead, you were the quiet stabilizer in an economy ruled by stomachs. And it wasn't just England. Throughout medieval Europe, similar rules existed, enforced by local councils, town elders, or, in some places, a guy literally called the bread weigher. Imagine that on your business card. These officials had one job: show up, weigh loaves, and cause panic. Think food inspector, but with more dramatic flair and far more public involvement. Because these inspections weren't private. Oh no. They happened right there, in your bakery, in the square, sometimes at the market, in front of an entire queue of hungry townsfolk. Picture it. A man in a thick wool cloak with an official-looking sash steps up, snatches a loaf from your shelf, drops it on the scale, and pauses. You swear you hear your own heartbeat echoing off the stone walls. If it's too light, he calls it out, loudly. The baker's bread is short, he says, and the people murmur. Your face burns. Maybe he slaps a fine on you. Maybe he takes your loaf and nails it to the bakery door with a little sign that reads, "Cheater." Maybe he throws the bread to the pigs. Which feels worse somehow. Like even the animals are judging you. Historians still argue whether these weighing practices were more about consumer protection or political control. Some suggest it was a way for authorities to keep craftspeople in line, to remind them who really ran the town. Others believe it was genuinely about protecting the poor. After all, when a family spends half their daily income on bread, a short loaf isn't just inconvenient, it's theft. There's a quirky little tradition tied to this, the baker's dozen. You've heard it before, 13 instead of 12. But do you know why? Because bakers were so terrified of giving short weight that they started tossing in an extra loaf. Just to be safe. Better to give too much and lose a few pennies than end up in the stocks with old crusts flying at your face. That 13th loaf? That was your insurance policy. You check your own scale again. Still even. You let out a breath. The loaves are legal. The crust's golden. And you feel, for now, safe. But even in this moment of calm, you know how fragile that balance is. One shipment of flour arrives damp and heavy? It skews your measurements. One young apprentice forgets to proof the dough long enough? It bakes uneven. And suddenly, you're staring down a fine you can't afford. And let's talk about the fines. They weren't light. Ironically, you could be charged money. Sure, but sometimes the punishment was public. You'd be marched to the town center, strapped into the pillory, and your offending loaf would be displayed around your neck like a bazaar. Gluten-filled necklace of shame. People would throw things, not rocks, usually vegetables. But still, it bruises more than just your skin. Some towns even burned the illegal bread publicly. The symbolism was clear. Bad bread is dangerous, dishonest, unfit for the community. It was practically witchcraft. And sometimes, when a baker was a repeat offender, their oven, yes, the oven, was literally destroyed, smashed to rubble by town guards. That's like losing your house and your job in one blow. No oven, no livelihood, no bread for anyone. You lean on your elbows and glance toward the window, where a line is beginning to form. The townspeople wait patiently, baskets in hand, children tugging on sleeves, already dreaming of the warm crust. You'll greet them all, smile modestly, pass them a loaf that's just the right weight, and they'll nod, maybe thank you, but most won't know just how much anxiety you wrapped into that simple round of bread. Because to them, bread is breakfast, but to you, it's a tightrope. And yet, as the door creaks open and the first customer steps inside, something like pride stirs in your chest. Because every single loaf you set on that shelf isn't just baked, it's balanced. Carefully, honestly, legally. It's heavy enough to feed a family, light enough to keep you afloat, and just right to survive another day in the strange, beautiful, utterly exhausting life of a medieval baker. Why bakers took oaths. The dough is rising slowly now, its surface pocked with gentle bubbles. A silent promise that soon it will become something more. But promises, in your world, are never left unwritten or unspoken. Before your first loaf ever touched the stone of that oven, before your apron was streaked with flour and your fingers learned the gentle give of proofed dough, you made a vow, not just to your guild, not just to your customers, but to bread itself. Yes, you swore an oath, and not a casual one like, I swear I won't burn the crusts today. No, we're talking full on, hand on holy relic, so help me God, level seriousness. Because in medieval society, bread was sacred, and the people who made it were bound to that sacred trust through something much deeper than business contracts. They were bound by oaths. And here's where things get deliciously dramatic. When you became a baker, you weren't just learning a trade, you were entering a covenant. Your word was supposed to be as firm and wholesome as your loaves. Your soul, ideally, as pure as your flour. So the oath you took wasn't just about not being lazy. It was about morality, about justice, about feeding the town in a way that kept everyone, rich and poor, pious and peasant, alive and anchored. Why the intensity? Because bread was quite literally life. If you sold dishonest bread, underweight, adulterated, overpriced, you weren't just a bad businessperson. You were endangering the entire community. And in a world already full of famine, disease, and unpredictable weather, people didn't take kindly to threats they could actually control. Hence, the oath. Your town may have required you to speak it aloud before a council or a guild master. You might have placed your hand on the gospel or a saint's relic. You might have sworn, by God and the bones of Saint Honoré, that your loaves would always be just, pure, and properly weighed. In some cities, the oath had formal language, old, creaky Latin phrases full of flowery gravitas. In others, it was more direct, something like, I swear not to deceive my neighbor by light bread, nor to cheat the weight, nor to keep old dough to mix into the fresh. Straight to the point. That one. Historians still argue whether these oaths had the force of religious sacrament or were more ceremonial. A kind of medieval HR onboarding with extra candles. Some scholars say they were moral contracts tied to salvation. Others claim they were just early versions of professional regulation, like a license to bake. The truth is probably somewhere in between. In some towns, bakers who broke their oaths were excommunicated. In others, they just had to pay a fine and retake the pledge. But either way, it mattered, because swearing meant you could be trusted. And trust, in the chaotic churn of medieval urban life, was worth more than gold. Let's not forget that in many places, bakers weren't just feeding the market. They were feeding monasteries, schools, orphanages, hospitals. These weren't just customers. They were the moral heart of the city. If you broke your bread oath, You weren't just cheating a hungry customer. You were betraying an entire system built on thin threads of belief and balance. There's a quirky tradition from parts of Germany where bakers were required to take their oath while touching a freshly baked loaf, warm, crusted, golden. They'd hold it like a relic, like a sacred text, and say their vows. The symbolism couldn't be clearer. The bread is both the thing you make and the thing that binds you, the source of your income, and the proof of your soul. And these weren't empty promises. You were held to them. If inspectors caught you cheating, shorting the scale, reusing spoiled dough, mixing in sawdust or chalk, you weren't just breaking the law. You were breaking faith. The punishment could be public, humiliating, or even spiritual. There are accounts of bakers being forced to confess their sins during Mass, kneeling in front of the altar while holding their fraudulent loaves like shameful children. Even worse, you could lose your guild status. That's like being exiled from your own profession. Once that happens, no one wants to hire you. No one trusts your bread. Your reputation, like a badly kneaded loaf, collapses in on itself. And still, every morning, you return to the bench. You weigh the flour. You wet the dough. You knead and fold and shape. Not just because it's your job, but because every act of baking is a quiet reaffirmation of that oath. Every honest loaf is a whispered, "I still mean it." Of course, some bakers took creative liberties. There were always ways to push the line. A bit more air in the loaf. A flour blend that wasn't technically impure, but definitely tasted suspicious. A slightly dampened crust to fake extra weight. You'd never admit it aloud, but sometimes, in lean seasons, desperate measures whispered their temptations. And then you'd remember the oath. The weight of it, the eyes watching, the small boy with his coin clenched in a sweaty palm, trusting you to feed his family. And you'd shake your head, and reach for the real flour. There's an unspoken pride in it, a kind of dignity that comes not from wealth or titles but from being needed. People talk about knights and kings. But you keep people alive. Quietly, steadily, every morning. No trumpets, no fanfare, just fire, flour, and faith. And when you close up the shop at night, scraping stray crumbs into the gutter, you sometimes whisper the oath again. Just for yourself, just to hear it, a quiet promise to a sleeping town. Because when the world is uncertain, when famine looms, and the wolves howl beyond the woods, there's one thing people cling to, the hope that tomorrow, there will be bread, and someone trustworthy to make it. The assize of bread, spoiler, not fun. The street outside your bakery is waking up. The first echoes of wooden wheels clatter down cobbled lanes. And the butcher's boy trots past with a squealing piglet under one arm and a guilty grin on his face. You stretch your arms, flicking a dusting of flour into the morning light, and brace yourself. Because today might be inspection day. And when you live under something called the assize of bread and ale, every single day could be the one where your livelihood's turned inside out and weighed in public. The name sounds quaint, like a medieval cooking class at a themed tavern. But in practice, it's closer to a bureaucratic boot pressing down on your kneecaps. The assize of bread was first issued in England in 1266, under King Henry III, and though other European regions had similar systems, this one went full spreadsheet mode. It was designed to regulate the price, weight, and ingredients of bread in direct relation to the cost of wheat. So, if wheat got cheaper, your bread had to get heavier. If wheat prices rose, your loaves could be lighter, but only just enough. Everything was tracked in meticulous tables, some of which looked suspiciously like cursed Sudoku. And yes, you were expected to keep up with it all. The basic idea was fairness. The people needed protection. Bread was the heart of the working class diet, and the authorities couldn't afford for shady bakers to profit off famine. So they put the whole trade under official watch, like medieval price controls crossed with religious oversight and a dash of theatrical punishment. And you, dear baker, get to live with that math every day. You probably have a little chart pinned behind your workbench. Something like, if wheat costs 12 shillings per quarter, then a penny loaf must weigh X ounces. The town reeve might post the current wheat prices weekly. Your job? Do the math. Every single day. Then bake to match. Forget, miscalculate, or cut corners, and boom, you're branded a fraud. Let's not sugarcoat it. The assize was exhausting. It assumed you had perfect flour, consistent ovens, stable humidity, and zero distractions. You have none of those. Your flour is sometimes gritty. Your oven burns hot on one side. And your apprentice? Lovely lad, heart of gold, but he once tried to knead dough with a broom handle because it looked easier. Still, you try, because breaking the assize wasn't just a slap on the wrist. It was a very public, very messy event. Here's how it usually played out. Early in the day, a bread official, sometimes called the ale conner or bread weigher, would arrive unannounced. Cloak fluttering, book in hand, he'd stride in like a medieval health inspector on caffeine. He'd select a loaf at random, set it on his traveling scale, and stare at the needle like it owed him money. If it met the standard, a nod, maybe a curt, carry on. If it didn't, oh, boy, depending on the offense and your town's level of drama, you might face a fine, a public warning, or a day in the pillory. Some towns had designated bread offenders' walls, where underweight loaves were nailed up for the public to gawk at. A kind of gluten-based wall of shame. Others preferred spectacle, marching you through the square with your bad bread strung around your neck. A sign proclaiming, "I cheated the loaf," while villagers jeered and children pelted you with crusts. Quirky detail? In London, they sometimes burned the offending loaves publicly. Not you, thank goodness, but the bread. Right there in front of everyone. Tossed into the flames like some carbohydrate sacrifice. The message was clear. Bad bread doesn't belong among us. Historians still argue how strictly the assize was enforced. Some believe inspectors were overzealous, eager to punish. Others think enforcement was spotty and selective, depending on politics or personal grudges. There's even debate about whether the assize made things better or just created a lot of angry, nervous bakers. But there's no denying it shaped your daily life. It made you triple-check your scales. It made you fear fluctuations in the wheat market more than the plague. It made you wake up in cold sweats muttering, 6 ounces at 12 pence. No more, no less. And yes, it applied to ale, too. Brewers weren't safe either. If your beer was too weak or overpriced, you might join your bread-making buddies in the public pillory, maybe even next to each other, trading tips on how to survive being tomatoed in the face. But here's the strange thing. The assize also created a kind of unity. A shared understanding between town and baker. You weren't a mysterious figure behind closed doors. You were a visible, regulated part of the civic body. People knew your name, knew your shop, knew you were held accountable. And in a world teetering between starvation and superstition, that visibility built trust. Your work wasn't just feeding people, it was reassuring them that someone, somewhere, was keeping the scales balanced. That the loaf they held was what they paid for. That the system wasn't rigged. That at least this one thing, among all the chaos, was fair. You glance down at your latest batch cooling on the counter. They're warm, golden, and, thank the saints, perfectly weighted. You wipe your brow with your sleeve and lean on the table. Satisfied, for now. But in the back of your mind, you know the assize will never leave you alone. It will follow your fingers, whisper in your ear, haunt your weighing bowl like a ghost in chainmail. It is the law that bakes with you. And still, you rise before the sun, fire your oven, and swear, quietly, faithfully, to get it right. Because one honest loaf, perfectly weighed, is worth 100 apologies, sawdust and lies. You roll out the dough on your workbench, the soft mass stretching under your palms with that familiar resistance. You dust your hands in flour. But there's always a whisper in the back of your mind, don't take shortcuts. Because in your line of work, temptation doesn't just knock, It hammers on the door with a sack of sawdust and a devilish grin. Welcome to the underbelly of medieval baking, where not all loaves are honest. And not all bakers keep their word. You're one of the good ones, of course. You took the oath. You watch your weights. You know your barley from your buckwheat. But not everyone's so virtuous. In hard times, say, after a failed harvest or when the grain supply runs dry, less scrupulous bakers have been known to stretch their dough in all the wrong ways. Sawdust, chalk, dried beans ground into a coarse powder, even clay, anything that adds bulk, weight, and the illusion of abundance. Disgusted? You should be. But let's be fair, desperate people do desperate things. When your family's hungry, your shop's on the brink, and your customers expect loaves whether there's flour or not, some folks reach for the sawdust scoop. One of the most infamous additives was ground peas meal. Sounds harmless, right? Except it was often old, dusty, and loaded with weevils. And yet, it was cheaper than grain, and could be mixed into bread without too much suspicion. That is, until someone bit down and cracked a molar. Or worse, got sick, really sick. Historians still argue whether the worst of these adulterants were common practice or desperate anomalies. Some believe they were used more often than records suggest, because who writes about being quietly poisoned? Others argue that most bakers, especially those under guild supervision, wouldn't dare risk their reputations. But let's just say this. The threat was real enough that many cities introduced official bread tasters. Yes, that was a job. Imagine waking up each day knowing you might sample sawdust soufflé before breakfast. Quirky tidbit? In parts of France and Flanders, there were laws banning the mixing of false flours, and some bakeries had to keep a sample of each day's dough on record for review. Like a medieval batch test. If someone got ill and pointed a flour-covered finger at you, the magistrate could demand you hand over yesterday's crusty evidence. And if you were caught? Let's just say the punishment wasn't a quiet slap on the wrist. You could be fined, jailed, pilloried, and in some places, permanently banned from baking. That's like excommunication for carbs. Worse, in the eyes of your community, you weren't just a bad baker, you were a deceiver. A poisoner. It stuck, and it followed. Some towns even had what were known as bread ordeals. No, not the dramatic, walk-on-fire kind. These were symbolic retributions. If your bread made someone ill, you might be made to eat only your own bread for a month. Publicly, if it was good enough for others, it better be good enough for you. Spoiler. If you'd stuffed it with chalk, you were going to have a very uncomfortable 30 days. Of course, not all impurities were illegal. Some were traditional. Cooks in certain regions added herbs or ash for flavor. In others, the use of acorns, nuts, or even dried fruit was allowed during festive seasons or feast days. The line between innovation and deception was razor thin. And you, the baker, walked it with every batch. You glance over at your flour sack. It's getting low. You'll have to visit the market tomorrow and hope prices haven't risen again. You remember the time your neighbor down the lane tried mixing bean husks into his loaves. It worked for 2 weeks, until a merchant spotted something green and stringy in his crust and screamed loud enough to summon the town reeve. His oven was smashed, his shop padlocked. He left town in disgrace. Last anyone heard, he was trying to sell honey cakes by the river. Poor soul. So no, you don't cheat. Not because you're some paragon of virtue, but because it's just not worth it. The bread you make is simple, honest, rough around the edges, but it's yours, and it doesn't crunch unexpectedly. Still, when times get lean, you feel the pressure. A single bad season, and your flour runs out before the orders do. The temptation creeps in again. Just a handful of filler. No one will know. But then you see the boy who comes every morning for a crust, his mother too sick to work. His eyes always hopeful, and you remember what the bread means. It's not just a food. It's a promise. And promises aren't made with sawdust. You knead with a little more force. your fingers punching down the dough as if silencing the whisper. You know the risks. The bread tasters, the inspectors, the parish priest who occasionally stops by and asks too many questions about the freshness of your yeast. And maybe, just maybe, there's something holy in that. In making something real, something safe, something that will warm a family and fill a belly. And not cause internal bleeding. Besides, the town has a long memory. They never forgot old Edwin the adulterator. And they'll never forget you. Either, for better or worse. So you do it right. Every time. Even when it's hard. Even when the flour runs low. Because in this world, good bread isn't just nourishment. It's character. In crust form. The pillory. Baker's timeout corner. The morning sun filters through the bakery's dusty windows now, painting golden lines across the warm crusts cooling on your shelves. The loaves are perfect, just the right weight, texture, and color. But perfection isn't always enough. Not here. Not when one mistake can send you from the safety of your oven straight into the town square. Face first into the most humiliating punishment a baker could endure. Yes, today we're talking about the pillory. The medieval version of a bad Yelp review, except instead of 1-star ratings. You get rotten cabbages hurled at your head. Picture this. You're dragged from your shop by the town official. Your offense? A loaf of bread found to be 2 ounces short. That's it, 2 ounces. Maybe your apprentice mismeasured the flour. Maybe the humidity made the dough shrink more than expected. Doesn't matter. Justice must be served. And in the Middle Ages, justice came with wooden restraints and a public audience. The pillory was typically placed in the heart of the town, near the marketplace or the church, prime real estate for maximum exposure. A thick, upright wooden post with a hinged board at the top, notched for your head and hands. Once locked in, you couldn't move, you couldn't duck, you just stood there, like an overcooked baguette, ready for judgment. And judgment came swiftly. People threw things, old vegetables, mud, dung, if they were feeling particularly expressive. Children jeered, neighbors whispered. The baker, you, was now the center of attention for all the wrong reasons. But the worst part wasn't the filth. It was the bread. Because in cases involving dishonest loaves, it was customary to hang the actual offending bread around your neck. That's right, a twine loop through a crusty round. Tied like a sad necklace of shame. A visual symbol of your crime. A loaf so dishonest, it deserved a front row seat to your downfall. And if that wasn't bad enough, sometimes they didn't use your actual bread. Sometimes they made a replica, an exaggerated, oversized loaf made from clay or wood. Something ridiculous and impossible to miss. Just in case someone in the back of the crowd hadn't quite grasped the lesson. Quirky tidbit? In parts of Germany and the Low Countries, bakers were sometimes forced to eat their bad bread in the pillory. Not a nice meal, mind you. Just bite after bite of their own deception. Chewed slowly under a rain of insults. It was a punishment meant to humiliate and educate all at once. See this man? The crowd was told. He fed us poorly, now he feeds on his own shame. Historians still debate whether these punishments were more about moral instruction or pure public entertainment. There's certainly a theatrical quality to it. The medieval world loved a good object lesson, especially one involving food, but others argue it was a crucial way to uphold trust in a society where reputation was everything. No social media, no consumer protection agency, just word of mouth, and a guy in stocks with breadcrumbs on his tunic. Of course, some bakeries had contingency plans. A second scale, an extra loaf, a carefully written ledger showing every ounce of flour used that week. You knew the risks. You'd seen other bakers suffer. And you weren't about to end up like them. You remember old Marta, the widow baker from 3 streets over. Lovely woman, baked sour rye like it was kissed by angels. But one season, her flour supply was tampered with, watered down. Full of grit, she didn't know. Baked anyway. A nobleman got a bad bite and summoned the bread officer. Next thing you know, Marta's in the pillory, sobbing. Her prized rye looped around her throat like a noose. She never recovered. Her shop closed within the year. Reputation? Gone. So you don't take chances. You weigh. And re-weigh. You cut open loaves just to check the crumb. You scold your apprentice for the slightest misstep. Not out of cruelty, but out of fear. Because once that pillory claim hits your name, you can't knead your way out of it. Still, you wonder, does the punishment fit the crime? 2 ounces short, and you're publicly humiliated. Yet a landlord can raise rents by double. And no one throws lettuce at him. But that's the thing. Bread is personal, intimate. It's something people touch, chew, feed to their children. If it fails them, it feels like a betrayal. And honestly, you get it. You've stood in line yourself. Coins clutched tight, praying the loaf would be fresh, honest, warm. You've known hunger. That's why you became a baker. Because food is life. And to cheat someone of bread is to cheat them of hope. So you keep the pillory in the back of your mind, not as a constant threat, but as a reminder that even in a world full of war, plague, and crooked officials, the people still expect their bread to be fair. That's the line they draw. That's the hill they'll throw turnips on. You return to your loaves and tap one gently. The crust is perfect, the base rounded just right. You feel its weight and smile. No pillory today. But you never forget. Because behind every honest loaf is a baker who remembers what it felt like to see someone else locked in the square, head down, hands bound, bread swinging from their chest like an accusation carved in crust. And in this world, that memory rises faster than yeast. Ye old carb police. The day has properly begun now. The clang of iron horseshoes rings from the road outside, and the town crier's voice floats faintly through the thick bakery walls. Something about a missing goat. A merchant's dispute. And, yes, bread inspection scheduled for this afternoon. Lovely. You sigh. Because while most folks might fear tax day, you live in daily dread of something far more immediate. A visit from the carb police. No, not your modern nutritionist type wagging fingers at your gluten intake. These were the real deal, medieval bread inspectors. Armed not with calorie charts but official mandates and an appetite for busting fraudulent bakers. They weren't always called that, of course. In England, they might be bread weighers or ale conners. In the Germanic world, the broth-proofer. In France, perhaps less controleurs du pain. But no matter the name, their purpose was consistent, and their presence ominous. You glance around your shop. Everything looks in order. Loaves neatly lined, scales balanced, records clean. But the inspectors are thorough, methodical, and often just a bit dramatic. Because it isn't just about catching bad bread, it's about being seen catching it. Accountability, after all, is best baked in public view. These enforcers had official powers. Some were appointed by the town council, others by the guilds. Some were self-important merchants who treated the job like a holy crusade. Others were bored scribes finally given a reason to walk about and wave something besides a quill. But no matter the type, they all had one thing in common. They could make or break you with a frown. The process was simple, yet nerve-wracking. An inspector would enter your bakery unannounced, usually flanked by a local official or even a guard. They'd select a loaf at random, often from the middle of your display. As if suspecting you'd hidden the truth behind a pretty crust. They'd carry a scale, or sometimes commandeer yours. They'd weigh the loaf, test its density, poke the crumb, sniff for off smells, even break it open on the spot. Sometimes they'd use what they called a bread iron, a flat, heated rod placed against the crust to test moisture content. If it hissed too much, overproofed. If it sizzled not at all, too dry. Either way, their brows would furrow. You'd stand there, heart-thudding, wondering if today's humidity ruined your batch. Wondering if your apprentice, bless his clumsy hands, forgot to add salt again. Wondering if the inspector liked you. Historians still debate whether these officials were truly impartial. Some argue that corruption was rampant, that a silver coin slipped under the counter could buy forgiveness. Others suggest the fear of public revolt kept inspectors honest. One thing's certain, the power dynamic was real. The cart police didn't just check loaves. They kept you in line. And heaven help you if they found something wrong. Too light? You'd be fined. Too dry? Censured. A strange smell or color? Well, let's just say you might be encouraged to take a short break from baking, say 6 months or so. And if you were a repeat offender, or someone suspected of tampering, public punishment followed swiftly, often with loaves nailed to your shop door, as if to say, here lies the evidence of culinary betrayal. There's one documented case from York, in the late 14th century, where an inspector forced a baker to parade through town holding his bad bread like a rotten trophy. The loaf had been mixed with barley husks, technically legal, but frowned upon. The baker insisted he did it for flavor. The inspector insisted otherwise. The townsfolk just enjoyed the show. And yes, sometimes inspectors got it wrong. They mistook dark rye for spoiled wheat, misread a scale, or just had a grudge. Some bakers learned to keep records, meticulously noting each sack of flour, each ounce of yeast, each temperature shift. That way, if accused, they had something resembling a defense. The medieval version of check the receipts. Still, you feel the tension every time. Even now, knowing your bread is honest. Your hands sweat when the door creaks open and a man with a ledger steps inside. You greet him with a tight smile. He nods curtly, selects a loaf, weighs it, breaks it open, sniffs, and pauses. A moment stretches like overproofed dough. Then he scribbles something, returns the loaf, gives a nod, walks out. You exhale. No words were exchanged, but the judgment was clear. You passed. This time. Quirky detail? In some towns, the cart police didn't just inspect, they competed. Once a year, inspectors would rank the best bakers. And top performers might receive a small silver badge or even a tiny ceremonial spoon. A kind of medieval Michelin star. Some shops displayed these with pride, carving the date into their doorframes. Awarded Best Crumb, 1372. Not a bad line for the marketing banners, if you could read. And you can't help but chuckle, softly, as you return to kneading. Because for all their power, the cart police were also human. Once, one of them tripped in your shop and fell face first into a basket of rolls. You helped him up, dusted him off, and fed him a complimentary bun. No fine that day. So you carry on, because the rules, the inspections, the stress, they're all part of the rhythm. The cart police may haunt your dreams, but they also ensure the bread remains sacred, uncorrupted, trusted, and in a world where so much crumbles, it's good to know someone's watching the crust. The Baker's Guild, loaves and loyalty. You're scrubbing the counters now. The day's flour beginning to crust in the corners of your fingernails. When you hear the soft creak of the Guildhall bell, it rings once, low and deliberate. You pause, set the rag down, and wipe your hands. That sound isn't for the market. It's for you, for bakers. Because in this town, in this time, you're not just a solo craftsman with a warm oven and calloused palms. You're part of something ancient, something structured, something, well, occasionally terrifying. You're a member of the Bakers Guild. And that means everything. Guilds are the quiet backbone of medieval urban life. You might think of them like unions, but they're more than that, closer to a cross between a professional club, a religious brotherhood, a regulatory agency, and a fraternity with suspiciously intense candlelit meetings. For bakers, the guild is both shield and sword. It protects you. It also demands things in return. To be part of the guild is to be legitimate. You can't just hang up a shingle and call yourself a baker. Not here. First, you apprentice. For years, you sweep floors, carry sacks of flour heavier than your own dreams, and master the precise art of not getting scorched by the oven mouth. Then, if your master approves, you become a journeyman. You bake under supervision. You learn the codes. You memorize the weights. And maybe, just maybe, you get approved to present your master's loaf. Yes, that's a real thing. A test loaf. Sometimes several. Made to exacting standards and judged by the guild elders. If the crust is too pale, rejected. If the weight is off by an ounce, rejected. If your kneading technique seems sloppy, back to the bench. But if you pass, you earn not just the right to open your own bakery, you earn trust. That trust? It's what holds the guild together. Every baker in your city depends on the others to maintain the same standard. Because one bad loaf, one scandal, one headline-worthy mix-up, and the entire guild could face consequences. So there's pressure. Unspoken, but firm. Don't embarrass the apron. The guild sets your prices, negotiates with the city council, and maintains the assize tables. It organizes feast day processions, yes, with matching cloaks, and ensures there's always bread available during times of famine or festival. It's a support system in times of crisis, a policing mechanism in times of dishonesty, and occasionally, a social club with better wine than the taverns. You've been to the meetings. The hall smells like wax and barley. The benches are hard, and the air is thick with a strange mix of reverence and gossip. There's always one elder who insists things were better in his day. One journeyman arguing for the right to bake carrot loaves. And always, someone trying to adjust the weights by half an ounce to match the new barley prices. Historians still debate how powerful these guilds really were. Some argue they were just puppets of the town council, easily overridden. Others claim they acted like little kingdoms, with guild masters wielding the influence of minor nobility. The truth? Probably somewhere in between. In wealthy cities like Florence or Bruges, the guilds had major political clout. In smaller towns, they were mostly just trying to keep the flour flowing. Quirky tidbit? Some bakers' guilds had patron saints, and celebrated them with cake. Not cake, but elaborately shaped breads, blessed in church, paraded through the streets, and then handed out to the poor. It was part religious offering, part marketing stunt, and if your loaf cracked during the parade, you'd hear about it all year. But the guild isn't all ritual and rules. It's also family. When your neighbor's bakery burned last winter, it was the guild that helped rebuild it. When your apprentice broke his leg falling off a flour cart, the guild covered his recovery. When grain prices soared, and you couldn't meet your quota, the guild gave you time to recover, as long as you attended 3 extra meetings and agreed to clean the communal oven on Saint's Day. Fair trade. You think of old Tomas, the master baker who took you in when you were 13. He taught you to fold dough with your thumbs, to check for doneness by listening to the loaf's song as it cooled, to always brush the hearth with respect before the first bake. He passed last year, buried with a small round loaf clutched in his hands. The guild covered the funeral. Every baker attended. No one spoke during the final procession. Just the soft creak of carts and the quiet crackle of fresh crusts cooling on linen. That's the thing about the guild. It's not just business. It's legacy. 1,000 tiny rituals, habits, and handshakes passed down across centuries. A chain of dough-streaked memories connecting you to bakers long dead and yet somehow still whispering behind every rising loaf. You clean the last tray, then glance toward the window. Across the street, another baker, Henrik, raises a hand in greeting. He's guild, too. You trained together, competed, even, but you've covered shifts for each other. Swapped yeast in lean times. Laughed, once, over a shared bottle of apple brandy when neither of you could figure out why the sourdough kept collapsing. Turns out the flour had been cursed. Or badly stored. Same difference. And that's what it means to belong. To a guild. To a craft. To a story that began long before you and will continue long after you're gone. You stack the trays, bank the fire, and whisper the guild's evening phrase to yourself as you close the door behind you. Honest hands. Honest loaves. It's old-fashioned, a little cheesy, but in a world built on trust and flour, it still holds weight. Literal holy bread. Batman, you light the final candle as the dusk spills across your shop. And for a moment, the quiet settles like a benediction. You're surrounded by loaves, rows of golden crust. The scent of warm yeast still rising in the air. It looks, frankly, like a scene from a holy painting. And maybe that's not an accident. Because in the medieval world, bread wasn't just nourishment, it was sacred. Like, literally sacred. And as a baker, you weren't just a tradesman. You were a spiritual steward, part alchemist, part priest, part yeasty midwife of divine carbs. It sounds dramatic, doesn't it? But think about it. In medieval Christian Europe, bread wasn't only daily food. It was also the center of the Mass, the Eucharist, the host, the body of Christ. The holiest ritual of the Church was built entirely around bread. So naturally, the people who made it, you, were expected to approach their work with reverence. Now, no one was asking you to be a monk, but many bakers followed specific rituals to ensure their bread was both technically good and spiritually clean. That meant praying before baking, avoiding impure thoughts while kneading, good luck with that one, and never, ever, using flour that had been improperly stored or handled. Because spoiled grain wasn't just a health hazard, it was an affront to the divine. There's an old tale, probably exaggerated, as most medieval stories are, about a baker who used flour from a pagan mill. His bread, once baked, refused to cool. It steamed and hissed for 3 days. Like it had a demon in it. The villagers refused to eat it. Eventually, the bishop had to bless the oven before baking resumed. Coincidence? Probably. But in this era, every crust told a story. In fact, some bakers, especially those supplying bread to churches, took their work as a sacred calling. Their kneading bowls were treated like altars. Their ovens, small chapels of fire. Some even hung tiny crucifixes above the hearth, just to be safe. And if a loaf came out burnt or split down the center, that wasn't just a mistake. That was a warning, a sign, a divine displeasure in crust form. Historians still argue about how seriously bakers viewed this role. Was it true devotion, or a practical way to boost credibility with a deeply religious clientele? Either way, the result was the same. Bread, made with care, was considered a moral good. Dishonest bread? A sin with very real consequences. That brings us to church bread itself. Every parish needed a supply of altar bread, flat, unleavened, delicate as parchment. These weren't your usual crusty rounds or hearty loaves. No, this was holy work, often made by cloistered nuns or guild-approved bakers. This bread had to be pure, no salt, no sugar, no additives. The process was almost meditative. Grain ground by hand, dough rolled thin, stamped with a holy image, then baked in small, clean ovens set aside for this purpose only. Fun fringe fact? In some places, bakers who made altar bread were forbidden from touching other dough during the same day. Too much flour mixing, too much risk of contamination. So, for those 24 hours, their hands were purely ecclesiastical. Holy hands, holy bread. And here's something even more interesting. The line between sacred and secular bread often blurred. On religious feast days, towns would commission enormous loaves, sometimes shaped like saints, angels, or even entire biblical scenes. You might be asked to bake a miracle loaf, shaped like a fish, or a ladder to heaven. Not practical, sure, but symbolic, memorable. A bread sermon, if you will. There's one record from 15th century France where a guild of bakers created a giant loaf of charity, nearly 6 feet long and shaped like a heart. It was paraded through town, blessed by the bishop, and then cut into slices for the poor. People wept, bakers were praised, and yes, the leftover crumbs were gathered like relics. Of course, not everyone saw the divine in dough. There were critics, skeptics, and the occasional town preacher who insisted bakers were far too proud of their yeasty miracles. One particularly fiery sermon warned, The baker who boasts of his loaf risks feeding the devil. Tough crowd. But you understand the balance. You know that flour, water, salt, and yeast can become something extraordinary, not just because of chemistry, but because of intention. You felt it. That moment when the crust splits just right. When the steam rises like incense. When a hungry child bites in, and his face lights up like stained glass in morning sun. And sure, your loaves might not appear on altars, but they still offer comfort, warmth, and a bit of hope in uncertain times. That counts for something. That is something holy. So tonight, as you cover the last of the day's bread and bank the oven's coals, you whisper a quiet thanks to the grain, to the fire, to the saints of flour and flame who watch over bakers like you. You make a small cross in the air, not out of superstition, but out of habit, out of respect, because tomorrow, the town will wake hungry. And you'll be here, hands ready, heart steady, to offer them not just bread, but something that might just feed the soul. Wheat wars, crop fails and starving crowds. You awaken before the town stirs. The oven is still smoldering from last night, and you stoke it back to life with practiced ease. But today, something feels different, heavier, quieter. The grain shipment hasn't arrived. Again, your flour sack is nearly empty. And in the medieval world, that's not a mere inconvenience, it's the prologue to disaster. Because when the wheat fails, the whole town feels it. And you're the front line. Let's rewind a bit. Wheat, barley, rye, these aren't just ingredients. They're lifelines. And they're terrifyingly vulnerable. Too much rain? The grain rots. Too little? It dries out. A fungus called ergot infects the harvest and suddenly people start hallucinating snakes in their porridge. Plagues of locusts, bad wind, war, or a noble's poor planning. They all mean the same thing, no bread. When grain fails, your entire system collapses. The millstones go silent. The market stalls empty. The town starts whispering. And all eyes turn to the baker. You're the one they expect to make something from nothing. You're the one they hope can stretch that last sack of rye just a bit further. And when you can't, they blame you anyway. Historians still debate how often medieval famines occurred. Some argue they were a once-a-generation catastrophe. Others say small-scale shortages were constant. But one thing's certain, when the grain ran out, panic wasn't far behind. People became desperate, irrational, and sometimes dangerous. There's a documented account from the 14th century of a French town where the baker was mobbed after refusing to sell his final batch. Not because he was hoarding it, but because he had to save it for the local hospital. The crowd didn't care. Bread was bread. They took it, burned his shop, and left him penniless. And yet, you still wake every morning and bake. You begin checking your reserves. You sift every last bit of flour, removing small pebbles and husks by hand. You eye the bucket of starter dough, wondering how far you can stretch it. You even whisper a quick apology to your yeast. It's about to be overworked. Meanwhile, in the town square, people grumble. The market's half full. The fishmonger is selling old trout again. Even the alewife looks nervous. Everyone's waiting for the grain carts. And if they don't come, you can already hear the knock at your door. Sometimes the towns try to help. Officials might release emergency grain stores, if they have them. They may order bakers to keep producing, even at a loss, or they issue price freezes to prevent hoarding. But that just shifts the burden. Because now, you're expected to sell your precious bread for the same coin that bought flour 2 months ago, except the flour now costs double. Quirky tidbit? In Florence, there was once a rule that bakers during a famine had to bake a type of emergency bread, dry, hard, bland, but long-lasting. They called it pane povero, or poor bread. It kept people alive, barely, but it also bruised more than a few teeth. You've made poor bread before. It's heartbreaking. The dough resists you. It doesn't rise right. The crust turns sullen and bitter. You see it in the faces of the children who bite in. Not joy, but resignation. Bread, stripped of its warmth, And still, you bake. Because to stop is to surrender. Historians still argue whether bakers had secret caches, whether some of them truly hoarded grain to profit later. Some say yes. A few bad actors gave the profession a bad name. Others insist most bakers were barely surviving themselves. You lean toward the latter. You've seen the math. You know how many loaves a single sack yields. You know what a missing day's flour feels like in your bones. There were times, of course, when entire regions suffered. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 hit nearly all of Europe. Endless rain ruined the harvests. Roads turned to mud. Crops drowned in their own fields. In some places, people dug up roots, ate grass, even resorted to far darker measures. And through it all, bakers tried, with moldy grain, stolen sacks, even acorn flour, anything to keep the ovens hot. Because a cold bakery meant the town had given up. You've never forgotten the story of the baker in Bruges who ground chestnuts into paste and mixed it with barley. The loaves were dense, gray, and crumbled into bitter dust. But they filled bellies. People remembered. A statue of him still stands there. Not heroic, just there. A man who baked through the hunger. You stare at your own loaves now, small, cracked, not your best, but they're honest. You'll sell them for almost nothing. The guild won't fine you today. They understand. Everyone does. Except the hunger. That, unfortunately, doesn't negotiate. You think about skipping your own meal. Save that last heel for someone who needs it more. The boy with the pale mother. The old man who buys only crusts and always pays in pennies. That's why you keep baking. Even when the flour's low, the fire's weak, and the walls whisper of famine. Because in the darkest times, bread is more than food. It's proof that the world hasn't ended yet. Bread is currency. Sort of. You're counting coins now, carefully lining them up beside your ledger. Rubbing a smear of flour off your fingertips so you don't smudge the numbers. But let's be honest, the coins don't really matter. Not in the way bread does. Because in your world, money is slippery, rare, and often suspect. But bread? Bread is solid, tangible, measurable, trustworthy. In many ways, it is currency. You've seen it 100 times. A man too poor to pay his rent hands his landlord 3 loaves instead. A servant earns part of her wages in daily bread, sometimes fresher than the noble family she works for gets. Children carry crusts to school in cloth wraps. Merchants settle debts with bushels of rolls. Even the local priest accepts tithes in the form of barley loaves during Lent. In medieval society, bread fills the economic gaps left by unreliable coins and inconsistent wages. Especially for those who live on the edge of poverty, which is most people. A coin might disappear, or be shaved, or mistrusted. A loaf, on the other hand, can be eaten, shared, or traded by nightfall. And it isn't just informal trade. In some towns, especially during shortages, the local authorities fix not just the price of bread, but its value. 1 penny loaf should feed 1 man for 1 day. That's the logic. So you, as a baker, are quietly baking a form of social calculation. 1 crust equals 1 meal equals 1 human day. Your shop is a currency exchange. Except instead of gold, you traffic in crumbs. Quirky historical side note. During grain riots, one of the most feared rumors was that bakers were hiding loaves or selling them secretly to the rich at inflated prices. So guess what towns sometimes did? They demanded public baking. You'd have to bake with the oven door open, in full view of the community, so everyone could see exactly how many loaves came out, and who walked away with them. You never forget the time a nobleman sent his servant to your shop with a purse full of silver, hoping to buy an entire batch. You refused, not because you're reckless, but because that would have meant none for the others. You'd have been rich, yes, for a day, but ruined by week's end. The townsfolk would have turned on you faster than a boiling pot of barley. Historians still argue whether this sort of bread economy helped or hindered medieval markets. Some say it stabilized local economies. Others claim it kept peasants trapped in a barter loop, unable to build wealth. You can see both sides. But one thing's for sure, in a pinch, bread is safer than coin. Even taxes were sometimes paid in bread. Your own guild dues? You've paid them in loaves before, 5 large rounds. Crusted and clean, placed on the master's table at the quarterly meeting. A ritual as much as a payment. A kind of edible receipt. In monasteries, especially, bread served as salary. Novices might earn extra portions for good behavior. Sick brothers received special, comfort loaves, infused with herbs. And yes, there was a hierarchy. A monk who labored in the fields might get coarse rye, while the abbot dined on white wheat rolls shaped like miniature crowns. And let's not forget feasts and weddings. Bread isn't just traded, it's displayed. At noble tables, loaves were carved into symbols, eagles, lions, even family crests. One baker you knew once shaped a dozen tiny loaves into a complete nativity scene. It took 3 days. The guests ate the baby Jesus before the breadsmith even got paid. Of course, not all exchanges were so ceremonial. Often, it was quiet. A mother would slip into your shop, eyes hollow, and leave behind a pair of hand-stitched gloves. You'd hand her 2 loaves. No words needed. Bread was the language. And then there were tokens. Ah yes, bread tokens. Little discs of wood, metal, or clay, stamped with a symbol, often your mark or the town seal. You'd issue them to customers who couldn't pay right away. They'd bring them back later. Redeemable for a loaf. A trust system. Fragile, yes, but functional. The butcher once tried it, too. But handing someone a token for future meat doesn't quite warm the heart the way bread does. You've even used loaves to smooth tensions. A neighbor angry about smoke from your oven gets an extra crusty round. The local reeve, snooping a little too often, receives a surprise honey roll on market day. Call it bribery, call it goodwill, call it baked diplomacy. It works. One quirky fact you always chuckle at, in some towns. A certain size of bread, usually a large round, was only legal for offerings and taxes. Selling it privately was forbidden. That didn't stop you from making one once, of course. A perfect circle, heavy as a paving stone. Just to see if you could. You hid it under the counter for a week before feeding it to the pigs. Still smelled amazing. Bread as currency is beautiful in its simplicity. No need for exchange rates. No worry about forgery. Though you did once hear about a baker who hollowed out loaves to hide smuggled goods. Lasted a week before a loaf leaked brandy in the cathedral. That was awkward. Back in your shop, the final customer leaves with a smile and a warm half-loaf tucked under her arm. No money changed hands. Just a promise to help mend your fence next week. You nod. Fair trade. Because in your world, every crust has value. Every slice is a small, edible coin of trust. And as long as you keep baking, the town keeps spinning. Not on silver, not on gold, but on bread. The bread riots were real. You wake to shouting. It's not the usual morning bustle. Not the fishmonger yelling about eels or the distant clang of the bell tower. No, this shouting is sharp, urgent, angry. You rush to the bakery window and peel back the curtain. There's a crowd in the square. And they're not here for pastries. Your stomach sinks. You've seen this before. This is what happens when bread runs low, or worse. When people think it's being withheld. The town doesn't need facts. It just needs a rumor. A whisper that someone, somewhere, is hiding flour. That a baker's loaves came out too small. That the nobles got fed while the children went hungry. And just like that, the riot begins. Historians sometimes romanticize riots, paint them as moments of noble rebellion. But bread riots? They're desperate, raw. They start with fear and end with fire. And the baker, you'll notice, is almost always at the center. It's not fair, of course. You didn't control the weather. You didn't set the grain prices. You didn't sabotage the last harvest. But you're the one with the oven. The one with the loaves. The one standing between hunger and hope. And when people are afraid, hope is a fragile thing, easy to turn against. You remember the last time. It was 6 years ago. Late spring. The grain deliveries had been delayed for weeks. And tensions were high. A rumor spread. No one knew who started it. That you and the other bakers were keeping loaves in the back for special customers. You weren't. Not really. Maybe you set aside one for the apothecary's wife. She'd just lost a child. Maybe you slipped a roll to the priest in exchange for firewood. But hoarding? Never. It didn't matter. They came with stones, not questions. Your shop windows shattered. Flour was flung through the air like snow. Someone set fire to your storage shed. Another baker down the road, Merrick, was dragged from his shop. Forced to kneel and apologize while they pelted him with stale bread. And yet, you understood. In a sick way. Because bread wasn't just food. It was survival. It was justice. And when people couldn't get it, they didn't write letters. They threw fists. The authorities responded as they always did, too late. Too harshly. Guards arrived. Clubs were drawn. A few ringleaders were arrested. One woman was beaten for carrying contraband crusts. She'd stolen them from the steps of the church. Quirky historical note. In some towns, rioters didn't just attack bakeries, they staged mock trials for loaves. Yes, trials. They'd gather in the square, hold up the offending bread, and accuse it of crimes. Too light, too small, unholy crust. Then they'd sentence it, often to public smashing. You once saw a boy whack a 3-pound barley loaf with a stick until it crumbled like an overbaked tombstone. It would be funny if it weren't so frightening. The truth is, bread riots weren't rare. From England to Italy to the German states. Any time prices rose or grain ran dry, violence simmered just beneath the surface. Entire cities lived in uneasy truce with their food supply. And you, the baker, were a very visible fuse. Some cities tried to prevent this with bread watches, citizen patrols who monitored baking operations and reported price hikes. Others required bakers to post their prices daily in chalk on a board outside the shop. You do that now, every morning, part transparency, part self-defense. Historians still debate whether these uprisings were organized resistance or spontaneous chaos. Some argue they were political, aimed at corrupt officials who favored the rich. Others say they were just eruptions of need, fueled by hunger and helplessness. Either way, the effect was the same: buildings burned, lives were ruined, and bread, glorious, golden bread, became a weapon. Back in the present, you tighten your apron and step outside. The crowd is pressing toward Merrick's shop again. He's trying to reason with them, arms raised, palms open, voice trembling, but the air's thick with tension. You recognize some of the faces. Not criminals, not villains, just neighbors, friends, parents. They're not thinking clearly. They're thinking with their stomachs. And stomachs are persuasive. You do something foolish. You walk to your cart and start handing out your morning batch, 1 loaf per person. No charge. It's not enough. You know that. But it's something. Word spreads. The crowd shifts. Anger softens into confusion. Bread passes from hand to hand. A mother cries. A man kneels in the dust, breaking a roll in half for his child. Merrick stares at you, stunned. You nod. He gets the idea. He opens his own door. It's a gamble. You'll lose money today. You'll eat scraps for dinner. But maybe, just maybe, you'll keep the square from erupting. Because sometimes, peace smells like fresh bread. And you understand, better than most, that in a world where kings hoard gold and the heavens hoard rain, a baker with an open oven is more than a tradesman. He's a lifeline. Mystery of the baker's dozen. You're stacking loaves now, still warm from the hearth. Their crusts whispering little cracks as they cool. 11, 12, 13. You pause. 13? Why not 12? Why the extra loaf? Why do you, like every respectable baker in town, routinely give more than what was asked? Ah yes, The famous baker's dozen. The extra loaf. The mysterious 13th. A little odd, a little generous, and more than a little misunderstood. But like most things in your world, it has a story. And, spoiler alert, it's not just about kindness. Because the truth is, the baker's dozen exists not to delight the customer, but to protect the baker. You see, in a society where bread is measured, weighed, and inspected with almost religious intensity, the cost of getting it wrong is steep. We've seen what happens when a loaf comes in underweight. You've felt the sweat on your brow when the inspector's fingers press into your crumb just a bit too slowly. A short loaf isn't just a mistake. It's a crime, and a very public one. At that. So, at some point, perhaps in 13th century England, perhaps earlier, bakers started hedging their bets. Instead of risking the wrath of the authorities, or worse, the pitchforks of the mob, they began to toss in an extra, a bonus loaf, a bribe to the gods of regulation, just in case one of the others came up short. 13 for the price of 12. A clever insurance policy in crust form. Historians still argue where, exactly, the term baker's dozen first appeared. Some say it originated in London, where the assize of bread was strictly enforced, and inspectors were especially keen-eyed. Others argue it began further north, where traveling bakers had less consistent access to scales and needed to err on the side of generosity to keep their clientele happy. Either way, the 13th loaf became tradition. And yes, it applied to buns, too, rolls, biscuits, pastries, you name it. If it could be bundled in dozens, it could be blessed with a bonus. That's how you ended up delivering baskets of 13 honey rolls to the mayor's office during Michaelmas. Not because he needed 13, but because you needed sleep that night. Of course, not every customer expected the extra, and some, particularly the greedy, started demanding it as a right. You remember one particular merchant who stormed into your shop, furious that you'd sold him only 12 barley loaves. He slammed his coin purse on the counter like a gauntlet. You smiled, handed him a 13th, and politely reminded him he hadn't asked for a dozen. He'd asked for 12. He never made that mistake again. The baker's dozen has quirks, too. In some towns, bakers would make the 13th loaf slightly smaller, just enough to count. Not enough to bankrupt you. Others went the opposite way, making the bonus loaf larger as a show of goodwill. A kind of edible flex. The guilds even got in on it. Some declared that the 13th loaf must be of equal size and substance to the others, or it wouldn't count, because of course they did. There's a delightful tradition in parts of the Low Countries where bakers would carve small patterns into the extra loaf, crosses, stars, spirals. Some believed it brought luck. Others said it was a silent apology from the baker for daring to overstep the official dozen. A secret signal that said, "Forgive me, I only meant to be generous." Quirky fact? There's even a legend, almost certainly false, that a baker once baked a 13th loaf for a starving beggar who had no coin. And when the town questioned him, he declared, "Better one full stomach than one empty purse." He was fined, of course. But the beggar lived, and the phrase became a motto of sorts, scrawled on oven walls and scratched into flour bins. You've never carved a motto into your wall, but you have given extra loaves, even when no one was watching. Especially when no one was watching. Because the extra bread isn't just about fear or regulation. It's about pride, about care, about knowing that in a world always teetering on the edge of not enough, a little more can mean a lot. Still, it's not without its frustrations. That extra loaf comes out of your pocket, your ingredients, your firewood, and on days when your flour's running low and your back aches and your apprentice burns half the batch, again, it's tempting to skip it. But you don't, because reputation matters, and in a town where news travels faster than yeast rises, being known as the baker who cheats the dozen is a title you can't afford. So you make 13, even when it costs you. Because the 13th loaf is more than a number. It's trust. It's safety. It's a tiny insurance policy made of dough and crust and a whole lot of nervous sweat. You watch as your apprentice places the final loaf in the basket. He counts quietly, 11, 12, he hesitates. You raise an eyebrow. He grins, adds the 13th, and looks at you for approval. You nod. He's learning. Because someday, when you're gone and the oven belongs to him, he'll remember. He'll hear that whisper of tradition. And he'll know that even when no one demands it, even when flour is dear and the days are long, the baker's dozen still matters. Because it's not just about following rules. It's about feeding people right. Bread bans and black markets. It's just before dawn, and you're already baking in whispers. Not because the town is asleep, though it is, but because today's batch isn't entirely official. You glance over your shoulder. No sign of inspectors. No cloaked guild masters lurking outside. Just you, your apprentice, and a secret tray of loaves cooling quietly beneath a burlap cloth. Slightly smaller than regulation. Slightly fluffier than allowed. Bread from flour not recorded in your ledger. You've joined all along. Secret tradition. The underground world of black market bread. Surprised? You shouldn't be. Because in the medieval world, wherever there were laws, there were people bending them. And the assize of bread, for all its noble intentions, created one enormous, stifling, crusty bureaucracy. In hard times, or under overbearing regulations, even honest bakers had to find alternative methods. Enter the shadow ovens. Let's start with the bans. Town councils and church authorities regularly issued strict rules on bread. No selling during Lent. No baking on saints' days. No using white flour unless you were a certified master baker. No loaves above a certain size, lest they tempt vanity. Yes, really, vanity. In a loaf. There were even rules about who you could sell to. Nobles might claim the first pick of your batch. Certain guilds had exclusive access to specialty flours. You've had priests come in demanding loaves for a feast, and then refuse to pay, citing divine privilege. And you're left scrubbing the hearth and smiling politely, hoping to be repaid in salvation. So bakers got creative. Some started baking smaller loaves by night, slipping them to poor families who couldn't afford the regulated minimum purchase. Others traded loaves behind taverns or through second doors, one for coin, one for a promise, one for silence. You've done it too. That widowed 3 streets over, with 4 children and a cough that never leaves? She can't afford official bread, but she can sweep your shop twice a week. So you hand her a dark round of rye. Unofficial, unmarked, still steaming, and you say nothing. Historians still debate how widespread these black market bakeries were. Some claim they were rampant, with entire underground economies of flour, yeast, and forbidden buns. Others argue they were rare exceptions, punished harshly. But the truth? Likely somewhere in the middle. Quiet networks, shared secrets, the slow, smoky hum of rebellion under the crust. Quirky tidbit. In some towns, bakers caught operating outside the law weren't fined. They were forced to bake publicly for a week. Under watch, with prescribed ingredients and a crowd of nosy neighbors peering over their shoulders. Imagine kneading dough while 5 grandmothers argue about your flour blend. Worse than jail. Honestly. Then there's the noble black market. Oh yes, it wasn't just peasants buying underground bread. Rich merchants, tired of guild-controlled loaves, would secretly commission custom batches. Extra salt, extra butter, imported spices, forbidden luxuries, baked in private ovens and delivered through courtyards by candlelight. Once, you baked cinnamon bread for a duchess. She paid you in silk. You've never worn it, but it smells incredible. You remember a time, during a harsh winter, when the mayor declared a flour ration. You were limited to 1 sack a week. Impossible. Truly. The town still needed bread. So bakers whispered to millers. Millers whispered to smugglers. And soon, a steady stream of lost grain was appearing behind your shop, carefully measured, carefully undocumented. Was it illegal? Technically. But when the snow melted and the famine faded, no one said a word. Because the town had eaten. Because the children had lived. Because even the mayor's wife was fed with one of your contraband rolls. But there were risks. Get caught baking with unregulated flour. And you could lose your guild status. Get caught selling outside authorized hours. And you might be fined, or worse, exiled from the town for a month. One baker you knew in Ghent was accused of selling honey rolls during a fast day. He was stripped of his apron, forced to burn his bread in public, and made to kneel in the square with a sign reading, "I tempted the flock." Harsh? Perhaps. But medieval justice loved a dramatic metaphor. So why risk it? Because hunger doesn't follow regulations. Because mothers don't care what the assize says. Because sometimes, mercy matters more than measurement. And because, honestly, some rules were just absurd. You once saw a law that banned bread shaped like animals, claimed it encouraged pagan thought. Another declared no loaf could be so white as to confuse the humble. What does that even mean? You baked a particularly pale batch once and spent the afternoon fielding questions from concerned friars. And still, you keep baking, sometimes legally, sometimes quietly, but always for the same reason. Because bread isn't just business. It's survival. It's generosity. It's defiance. Tonight, as your apprentice locks the door, you slip one last loaf into a cloth wrap. You'll leave it by the monastery wall, an unspoken gift for the lay brother who's been coughing in the market. No charge, no thanks, just a crust and a chance. Somewhere in the darkness, others are doing the same. Bakers with cracked hands and careful hearts. Ovens glowing softly behind closed shutters. The black market isn't about crime. It's about kindness that didn't fill out the proper paperwork. And in this world, where rules can feel like chains, a single loaf passed hand to hand can feel like freedom. Royal taste testers and deadly dough. The coals in your oven glow low now. The final embers settling into a tired red as the town fades into twilight. Most of your loaves have been sold or traded. A few remain, small rounds and misshapen ends, comforting in their imperfection. But today, your thoughts are somewhere else. Not in your little shop. Not with your usual customers. No, tonight, you're thinking about palace bread. Because if you think baking for the local guildmaster is stressful, try baking for royalty. Imagine it, the castle kitchens, warm as midsummer, filled with noise and tension. Dozens of hands working in silence. Under the hawk-like gaze of the steward. The flour used here is whiter than snow. Sifted 4 times. Stored in cedar-lined chests guarded more tightly than the crown jewels. The eggs are fresh, the yeast carefully fed, and every loaf shaped just so, because appearance matters when you serve a king. And yet, despite the beauty, despite the wealth, every loaf carries a shadow, the threat of poison. Yes, you heard right, poison. Because in the world of royalty, betrayal often came hidden in the crust. A pinch of arsenic in the dough. A dusting of powdered toadstool. A particularly bold chef in one French court once used crushed pearls and snakeroot, beautiful, fatal, and undetectable to an untrained tongue. That's where the royal taste tester comes in. Their job? Eat the bread before the king does. If they survive the next 10 minutes, then and only then is the meal served. If they don't, well, let's just say turnover in that profession was rather high. You've never met one personally. But you've heard stories. A taste tester in Prague who refused to eat anything unless it was torn from the center of the loaf, because the crust could be swapped. But the core? That was honest. Or the man in Vienna who demanded that each baker sign his name onto the crust with the flour water paste. So there could be no doubt who made what. A signature in bread. Imagine that. Historians still argue how much of this was paranoia and how much was justified. Some say poisonings were rare, more feared than frequent. Others point to dozens of recorded deaths, convenient, sudden, unexplained, that followed a royal feast. Bread was the perfect vehicle. Soft, warm, absorbing every drop of whatever vile mixture someone might slip in. So yes, when baking for the court, you were under pressure. Every ingredient logged, every movement watched. You couldn't sneeze near the flour sack without a steward making a note. If the loaf was misshapen, suspicious. If it was too perfect, also suspicious. If your hands shook, you were probably a criminal. And heaven help you if the queen's dog got sick after nibbling a crust. Still, it wasn't all terror. It was also opportunity. If you passed the tests, if your loaves were praised, you could gain royal favor. Some bakers became fixtures of the court, granted titles, land, even pensions. There's a famous case in Aragon of a baker who, after 20 years of faultless crusts and safe deliveries, was knighted, Sir Bread, if you will, the scroll says, for steadfast service and the making of loaves most pleasing. Honestly, you'd take that over a gold medal any day. Quirky tidbit? Some royals believed bread held magical properties. They'd request loaves baked under a full moon, or with water drawn from a specific spring at sunrise. One particularly superstitious duchess demanded that her bread be kneaded clockwise only, lest the dough absorb backward energies. Her baker allegedly wore gloves made from rabbit skin, soft on the dough, questionable for hygiene. And then there were the test loaves, miniature duplicates of the main loaf, baked alongside it, to be tasted first, a small sacrifice to ensure the real deal was safe. You've done that once or twice yourself, not because of poison, but because your apprentice can't tell the difference between crusty and burned. But back to the court. Baking there wasn't just culinary. It was political. Loaves shaped like crests, rolls stamped with the royal seal, festive breads that told stories, knots for marriages, rings for alliances, towers for victories. You once heard of a baker in Burgundy who created a complete castle from bread, each turret filled with sweetened cream. It collapsed mid-feast. The king laughed. The baker cried. The cream exploded. And through it all, the taste tester sat in the corner, nibbling first, watching faces, waiting for the moment his own might betray him. You sometimes wonder what it would be like to bake under that kind of pressure, to shape something not just for hunger, but for history, to create a loaf that might change a man's fate, or end it. Here, in your little town, your bread won't kill anyone. You hope, but it also won't crown them. Your loaves are simpler, humbler, but no less important. You feed people who don't have tasters, who don't have servants, who take each bite trusting that it will fill, not fail. And in a way, that trust is just as sacred. Still, tonight, you try something new, a finer flour, a gentler knead, a careful shaping, not for royalty, just for a mother who lost her husband last week. She won't notice the detail, but you will, and maybe that's enough, because whether in a palace or a village, bread carries meaning, and every loaf, in its own quiet way, holds the power to heal or to harm. Magic, myths and bread spells. It's late now. The loaves are cooling, the hearth is dimming, and the streets beyond your bakery are hushed, but not silent. No, tonight you hear something else, whispers. Not from people, but from old stories, the kind passed down from grandmother to mother to child, the kind that float in with the flour dust and cling to your apron like superstition. Because in this world, bread is not just food, it's magic, not flashy, wizard in a hat magic, but the old kind, subtle, woven into rituals and beliefs. Quiet power, born from fire and grain and memory. And you, dear baker, are more than a craftsman. You are an unwitting conjurer of spells. Let's start with the dough. In many parts of medieval Europe, the rising of dough was seen as more than chemistry. It was life itself, a sign that the household was blessed, that the spirits were in harmony. Dough that refused to rise? Bad omen. Someone in the family might fall ill. Or worse. Quirky tidbit. Some bakers swore that talking too loudly around resting dough would frighten it. So kitchens were kept quiet during proofing. Almost like a chapel, you still find yourself whispering when the dough rests. Don't you? There were rituals for nearly every stage of bread making. Some families made the sign of the cross over the flour before mixing. Others kept a starter dough in the shape of a circle to ward off evil. Any square or sharp-edged loaf was considered risky business. You've met people who refused to slice bread after sundown, lest it invite wandering spirits into the home. Sounds strange? Maybe. But in a world with more questions than answers, bread became a vessel for meaning. You remember being a child, watching your grandmother draw her finger across the top of a loaf before slicing it. "So the devil won't sit on it," she'd mutter. You didn't understand then, but now, after years of baking, of rising and falling and watching the world tilt on its axis with every harvest, you kind of do. Historians still argue how much of this was belief versus tradition. Was bread truly magical, or did it just feel that way in a world so precarious? Did people really believe in loaf-bound blessings, or were they just trying to make sense of a difficult life? You suspect it's both, because even now, when you slide a golden round from the oven and see that perfect split across the top, something inside you breathes easier. And then there are the spells. Oh yes, actual bread spells. Not cast by witches in pointed hats, but by everyday folk, midwives, farmers, lonely shepherds, people who knew how to fold a prayer into the dough with every turn of the wrist. Want to protect your home from fire? Bury a crust near the threshold. Need to soothe a fever? Rub a warm roll across the patient's chest, then feed it to a dog to draw out the illness. And love? Don't even get started. Girls would bake little rolls with cloves and mint, hide them under their pillows, and whisper names into the rising steam. You've heard of bread divination. 2. Slice a loaf and count the air holes. An even number means good luck. Odd means trouble. Burn a small roll and watch the direction of the smoke. Left for sorrow, right for joy. Straight up, a miracle on the way. And let's not forget the bread curse. Rare, yes, but real enough to send shivers down your spine. A loaf baked with bitter herbs, shaped into a knot, and left at someone's doorstep. No one would touch it, not even the dogs. It was said to sour the luck of anyone who stepped near. One baker in your town once received such a loaf. She closed her shop the next day, moved to a village far away. No one ever found out who baked it. Not all bread magic was dark, though. Bread was used in weddings, blessed loaves torn by the bride and groom, shared with guests as a promise of prosperity. It was placed in the cradles of newborns to protect against the changeling. It was left on windowsills during storms, to keep lightning from striking the house. You've even seen loaves left at crossroads, offerings to travelers lost in more ways than one. And then there's the story of Saint Brigid, who once fed an entire village with a single loaf. Some say it multiplied in her hands. Others say it was just cut very carefully. Either way, her name lives on in kitchens across the land. You keep a sprig of her herb, marigold, tucked behind a beam above your oven. Just in case. Is it foolish? Maybe. But you still knock twice on the doorframe before you bake your first loaf each morning. You still hum that old tune your mother sang while shaping dough. And when a particularly beautiful loaf cools on your board, and the crust splits just right, and the scent wraps around you like a warm shawl, you still say thank you. To the wheat, to the fire, to whatever spirits may be watching. Because baking is more than mixing, more than heat and timing and skill. It's faith, in process, in pattern, in the quiet magic that turns 4 simple ingredients into sustenance. And as you dim the lantern and bank the fire for the night, you leave one loaf on the sill. Not for a customer, not for the morning crowd, but for something older, something unseen. Because in this world, some loaves are meant to be eaten, and others are meant to be believed in. It's nearly midnight now. The streets outside your shop are silent, save for the distant bark of a dog or the creak of shutters shifting in the wind. Inside, your bakery is still warm. The last loaves stacked neatly beneath linen cloths, each one a quiet testament to your labor. You should sleep, but tonight your mind drifts somewhere else. To all the times bread wasn't just a meal. It was survival. Because in the harsh, unpredictable rhythms of medieval life, bread was often the only thing standing between life and death. It was the meal that kept a farmer's family working through the final weeks of winter. The crust that got a sick child through the night. The offering made when there was nothing left to offer. In times of famine, bread became mythic, not a luxury, not a convenience, but a symbol of endurance, of stubborn, sacred persistence. You've heard stories, everyone has, of people surviving on bread alone for weeks. Soaked in broth, scraped into gruel, crumbled into water and shared around a fire. Just enough to keep the body going. Just enough to give the soul one more day. You remember one winter, years ago, grain prices had soared after a poor harvest. You were rationing flour down to the handful. A woman came to your door, wrapped in a threadbare cloak. Child on her hip, cheeks hollow. She didn't ask for charity. She asked for crusts. Just the ends. Just what you would have fed to the pigs. You gave her 3 full loaves. She cried. You didn't. Because in that moment, you knew. It wasn't about kindness. It was about necessity. A line in the snow between hunger and hope. And you've never forgotten the way her child clutched that first slice, like it was gold. Like it was proof that someone still cared whether they lived. Bread lines were real in your world. Long before they had that name. In the lean months, February, March, before the first greens, people queued outside bakeries with whatever they had to offer. Coins, yes, but also tools, clothing, promises. Some brought nothing but desperate eyes. You saw them, you still see them, you gave what you could. Some bakers didn't. They locked their doors, hoarded their grain, blamed market forces while their shelves sagged under unsold loaves. Those bakers didn't last, not because they were punished, but because their names, their reputations, those were starved. You think of bread not as wealth, but as time. Each loaf buys someone another day, a little longer to mend, to pray, to figure things out. And even when things got really bad, even when the mill was broken and the flour was coarse and bitter, you still baked. The town needed it, and you needed to give it. There's a story from the east, maybe Polish, maybe just a tale, that during a siege, the last bakers in the city ground tree bark into flour, baked it with salt and hope. It tasted like sawdust and grief, but it kept the defenders standing. That bread, they said, saved the city, not with flavor, but with will. Quirky tradition? In some villages, the first bread baked after a famine was given a name. Literally, Thomas, mercy, light. They were blessed, shared, and never eaten alone. Breaking that loaf was like breathing again after being underwater. The town felt it, even funerals. Bread was survival there, too. The mourners gathered, hungry from grief and travel, and were served black bread, dense, earthy, made with rye or acorn. It wasn't just food, it was comfort, a reminder that life, somehow, continued. You've baked those loaves, quietly, reverently. Historians still argue whether bread shortages were always caused by crop failure or sometimes engineered by lords, merchants, even church leaders, to drive up prices. But down here, in the ovens and the queues, those debates mean nothing. Hunger doesn't care why the bread's gone. It just wants to know when it's coming back. And so you've learned to make bread stretch. You've soaked old crusts into porridge. You've baked with cracked grain, with peas, with lentils. Once, ashamedly, you even tried sawdust. It didn't go well, but you understood why others did. Because in a world where meals are uncertain, bread isn't just food, it's a gesture. Even now, when the flour flows freely and your shelves are full, there's a part of you that still bakes like it's winter. Like someone will walk in, empty-handed, and need a loaf more than they need their pride. And if they do, you'll give it to them. Not because you're a saint, but because once, someone did the same for you. And because one day, it might be you again, on the other side of the counter. That's the quiet truth of survival bread. It doesn't ask for thanks. It doesn't boast. It doesn't even taste particularly good. But it endures, and in enduring, it lets us endure. You take the last warm round from the rack, wrap it in cloth, set it by the door. Someone might come tonight, someone cold, or grieving, or simply unlucky. And when they knock, you'll be ready. Because in this life, not all heroes wear crowns. Some just wear flour-dusted aprons. And keep the fire burning. Bread for the dead. The shop is dark now, save for the glow of embers beneath the hearthstones. The day is done, but tonight, there's one last task. You move carefully, reverently. You mix the flour a little slower. You knead the dough with both hands. Silently, you shape the loaf round, smooth, and simple. This loaf is not for the market. It's for the dead. You see, in your world, bread isn't just for the living. It feeds memories, comforts the grieving, and in some places, perhaps even your own, serves as a final offering to the departed. Call it superstition, call it tradition, but when a soul leaves the body, someone always bakes. Funeral bread, mourning loaves, spirit crusts. The names differ, but the meaning is the same. You bake because you must. Because to bury someone without bread is to send them off empty-handed into the unknown. And so you bake. The practice dates back centuries. In some parts of Europe, families place a round loaf beside the body before burial, often sweetened. Sometimes braided, always symbolic. In others, bread is broken at the wake and passed to guests. One piece each, no talking, just chewing. The sound of crust breaking becomes a kind of prayer. Quirky fact? In parts of rural Germany, bakers were expected to provide the morning bread free of charge. It was considered a holy duty, a crust for the crossing. You've done it yourself more than once. For the old fisherman who used to trade you salted herring. For the midwife whose laugh warmed your shop more than your fire ever could. You remember kneading in silence that morning, feeling the absence settle into your bones. Some towns have more elaborate customs. There's the soul loaf, left on the doorstep overnight after someone dies. If it's gone by morning, it's said the soul has passed peacefully. If it remains untouched, more prayers, more bread. In Sicily, there's a tradition of baking loaves shaped like bones on All Souls' Day. Bone bread, eerie in name, comforting in practice. Children are given slices and told, "Eat for those who cannot." You've baked for wakes where the loaves were stacked high, towers of remembrance. Each one flavored slightly differently. The aunt's favorite herbs, the grandfather's preferred grain. You've seen crusts scored with initials, symbols, crosses, not for decoration, for direction, so the spirit can find its way home. Historians still argue whether these customs were truly about the afterlife or simply about comfort. A way to fill the bellies of mourners and distract the heart with something warm and tangible. But you know better. You've watched how people treat that first bite of grief bread. How slowly they chew. How their eyes glaze not with hunger, but with memory. And sometimes, bread becomes a bridge. You've heard of bakers placing small pieces of bread beneath headstones, crumbs for the journey. Or leaving a fresh roll in a church pew on the anniversary of a passing. One baker in your town, Old Betty, bakes a single sweet bun every year on the day her brother died. She doesn't eat it, she just sets it on the sill, wrapped in linen, and watches the sky grow dim. The belief goes deeper in some places. There are stories, whispers, that the dead can speak through bread. That if a morning loaf splits strangely or bakes unevenly, it's a message, a warning, a goodbye. You don't put much stock in that. Except that one time, that one loaf, the one for your sister. It cracked in the shape of her name. You didn't speak of it, but you remember. There's even a tale about a baker who tried to profit off funerals, charging double for morning bread. baking cheap loaves with poor flour. They say his oven went cold for weeks. No fire would stay lit. No dough would rise. He stopped baking altogether, moved to the coast, took up fishing. You don't mess with funeral bread. It's sacred, whether you believe in spirits or not. Tonight, your morning loaf finishes its bake. You set it on the counter to cool. You press your hand lightly on the top, still warm, still soft. You don't know who it's for yet, but you'll know soon enough. Perhaps someone will knock tomorrow. Eyes red, voice quiet. They'll ask, "Can you?" And you'll nod before they finish. Because in this life, you bake for the living. But in the quiet moments, you also bake for those who've gone. A crust for memory, a crumb for mourning, a loaf that says, "You mattered, you were loved, you are not forgotten." And sometimes, that's enough. The slow rise of trust. Morning again, light peeks through the cracks in your shutters. And the scent of the hearth's slow rekindling mingles with the damp stone floor. Another day, another dozen loaves. But something's different now. Quieter. Perhaps. Softer. Because after years of watching every ounce, of sweating through inspections, of dodging rumors and riots, you notice something else rising. Trust. It didn't happen all at once. It rose slowly, like a shy doe on a cold day. But you can feel it now. The people who come to your shop don't always weigh your bread in their hands anymore. They don't quiz you about grain type or crust texture. Some even smile before they taste. And that means something. In the old days, bakers were watched like criminals. We've seen it, scales checked, loaves dissected, crowds whipped into floury fury at the whisper of a short wait roll. Bread was too important, too central to life to be left to trust alone. But over time, something shifted, slowly, imperceptibly, loaf by loaf. You earned a reputation. You became the one who never shorted the scale. Who gave the 13th roll without being asked? Who offered old bread for free rather than letting it spoil? The one who didn't bake during Lent, even when others did. Who kept a crust at the ready for a widow, a waif, or a wandering monk? Your loaves are still inspected now and then. Sure, the carb police haven't vanished. But even they greet you with a nod. They know what to expect. And if a loaf comes in a touch underweight, they glance at the rest of the tray, see 3 extra, and move on. Quirky tradition? In some towns, the most trusted baker was given the honorary title of Keeper of the Hearth. Not an official role, just a token of community respect. You've never had the title. But last week, the blacksmith's daughter brought you a sprig of rosemary and said her father told her, "If you want real bread, go to the keeper." You didn't correct her. Historians still argue whether this trust was a product of better regulation or better baking. Did the assize finally settle things down? Did guilds train bakers more effectively? Or did townspeople just get tired of fighting over crusts and decide to believe again? You'd think it's simpler. It's about people, not systems. You remember old Marta, she of the cracked hands and humming voice, who gave away an entire batch during a flood. She never got paid. Her shop never recovered. But her name is still spoken with reverence. Not because she baked the best rye, but because she could be counted on. That's what trust is. In the end, not perfection, just reliability, predictability, a warm roll at the same hour each morning, a fair price, a loaf you'd give your children without hesitation. And it changes you, too, when the fear eases, when you stop dreading the inspector's knock, when your first thought isn't, "Will I survive today?" but, "Will the loaves be good?" You start to take pride again. Real pride, not the anxious kind, hiding behind rules, but the kind that wakes early because it wants to, not because it has to. You start experimenting. A little flax in the dough. A new braid for the feast day loaf. A lighter crust for the new mother down the lane who lost her appetite during the baby's sickness. She thanked you yesterday. Said the bread was the only thing she could keep down. You didn't charge her. That's the thing about trust. It multiplies. One loaf becomes 2. One gesture becomes tradition. The old man who used to scowl now waves. The boy who once weighed every roll now brings you a drawing of your shop, flour smudged and crooked and perfect. And you begin to realize something strange. Something wonderful. You're not afraid anymore. Not of inspections. Not of riots. Not of grain prices or guild fines or sourdoughs. You bake now from something deeper. Not just survival, but service. Bread still matters, of course. Still feeds. Still warms. But it also connects, binds, reminds that this life, for all its hardship, has moments of simplicity, of kindness, of shared crusts and unspoken gratitude. You place the final loaf on the shelf and pause. You don't check its weight. You know it's right, not by scale but by feel. And in that quiet moment, you hear footsteps outside. The first customer. They don't knock. They don't hesitate. They open the door, smile, and say, "I'll take my usual. I trust you." And just like that, the day begins again. From oaths to oven timers. Your apron hangs heavy with flour. Your hands ache in the familiar way they always do by evening. And the bakery is still. The kind of quiet that only settles when the final loaf has cooled. You lean on the worn counter and think, not of today's bake, but of everything that came before. The centuries behind each crust. The lives woven into every rise and fall. Once, bakers like you swore oaths over steaming loaves. They pledged their honesty to God, to guild, to grain. They were watched, weighed, feared, trusted. They navigated hunger and hope, weathered famine and flour riots, shaped loaves that fed kings and beggars alike. And now? Now, somewhere in the world, a baker checks a digital scale. The display beeps. The timer chimes. The convection oven hums with cold efficiency. The yeast arrives in vacuum-sealed packets. The flour from industrial mills that never sleep. No more horse-drawn grain carts. No more assize officers. No public pillories. Just paper hats, stainless steel counters, and the occasional online review. But beneath it all, something ancient lingers, because the oath, the real oath, was never about rules or fines or fear. It was about people, about feeding them honestly, about giving your best, every day, even when the world outside your bakery made no sense at all. You still do that, even if your scales are digital. Your hands know when a dough is ready. Even if the guilds have faded, you teach your apprentice the same way your master taught you. Even if no one demands a 13th roll, you give it anyway, not because you have to, because it feels right. You hear people say baking is a lost art, that machines have taken over, that the soul has gone out of the oven. You smile at that, because anyone who's truly baked, who's truly watched a loaf rise from nothing but flour, water, salt, and care, knows better. Bread still matters. People still gather for it. They break it in mourning, share it in celebration, whisper thanks over it, even now, in a world full of speed and screens and disposable everything. Bread still asks us to wait, to listen, to touch, to trust. You've seen it in your own shop. The student who buys the same crust every Monday before lessons. The old man who always requests the heel, because it reminds him of his mother's kitchen. The quiet woman who never speaks, but leaves a coin on the counter and bows. Just slightly. They still come. Not because of nostalgia. Not because they love carbohydrates. But because something in the warmth of a fresh loaf tells them, you are safe here. You are fed here. You are not alone here. That's the real legacy. Not the assize. Not the bread riots. Not even the pillories or the baker's dozens. But this, the slow, steady rhythm of a baker's life. The rise and fall of dough. The click of the latch at dawn. The rustle of cloth over cooling loaves. The trust. You pick up your broom and sweep gently around the hearth. A few crumbs tumble into the darkness. They'll feed birds by morning. The cycle continues. And somewhere, across town or across time, another baker moves through the same motions. Maybe with different tools. Maybe with different rules. But with the same heart. Because some things, some truly good things, never change. The oven is silent now. The hearth glows low, Like an old memory fading gently to ash. The streets are quiet. Even the wind seems to hush as it passes your shuttered windows. And here you are, still. Not needing, not selling, just resting. The day behind you, the world beyond you, and the quiet warmth of bread still lingering in the air. You think about everything the loaf has carried. Hunger, yes, but also love, also memory. You've shaped more than dough in your life. You've shaped comfort, trust, continuity. In a world that changes too quickly, too harshly, you've chosen patience. You've chosen warmth. You've chosen care. And tomorrow, when the sky begins to lighten and the first bird stirs, you'll rise again. Not because you must, but because it's what you do. What you've always done. What someone before you did. And someone after you will do. You'll light the fire. Mix the flour. Fold the dough with steady hands. And once more, you'll make something honest in a world that still needs it. So now, let yourself rest. Let the soft glow of the oven fade behind your eyelids. Let the rhythm of the bread, the rise, the fall, rock you gently towards sleep. You've done enough for today. You are enough for today. And somewhere in the dark, a crust still crackles in the cooling air, proof that good things rise. Even in silence,